Hi, and welcome back to our lecture here on the gifts of the British. In part one, we spent a lot of time talking about contributions the British have provided the modern world in terms of literature, government, industry, education, and really things that I think a lot of us know a little bit about. I think we've heard of Shakespeare. I think we know J.K. Rowling and J.R.R. Tolkien. Some of these things are just such important cultural cornerstones of literature and things like that. We know that we broke away from the British in terms of government. But one of the things that is kind of less talked about, maybe more so in history classes, is British imperialism. And imperialism is a scary idea. And we want to make sure we understand that the British brought their culture to really all corners of the globe, but maybe not so with the open arms of the people that they influenced. And we spent a lot more time looking at this specifically in world history in 11th grade, but we definitely want to make at least some major points here when we look at British imperialism, which is going to lead to conflict in North America called the French and Indian War. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, the British end up with the largest empire in the history of mankind. And an empire is really all territory that is controlled by one person or one country, bringing different peoples together under one rule. And so you can see everything in red here was once controlled by the British. Maybe not all at the exact same time, but at least at one point all controlled by the British. Nobody has had more territory than the British when you look at it this way. So their influence has been spread all over the world. So let's do a quick review on what imperialism is. Imperialism is a policy in which a strong nation seeks to dominate other countries politically, economically, or socially. And the sad truth of it is, rarely in history do you see another country trying to dominate another country politically, economically, or socially for the good of that other country. It's almost always a selfish endeavor, trying to pull resources out of another country, trying to make money, trying to gain land for naval ports and things like that. So oftentimes imperialism has a lot of negative connotation that goes along with it. So by the 1600s, Britain had built the British East India Company to conduct trade in the Indies and East Indies, or in India and the East Indies. The idea was they wanted to go trade with Japan, with China, with India, because there's a lot of spices and luxury goods that they could bring back home to Britain and sell at a higher price. It's just a money-making thing, but it's going to evolve from there. By the 1800s, roughly 200 years later, the British were basically poised to colonize the globe. They had the power, they had the ships, they had the military personnel to really kind of go and take whatever they wanted to take. British colonization did do some good things. So British colonization spread technology such as dams, bridges, and electricity, medicine, railroads, education, Christianity, and the English language to all corners of the globe. Now, if we were to only look at that, we'd say that's pretty good. The British went and built dams and bridges and provided electricity to a lot of people. They built railroads and railroad lines all over that these people like India and Africa could use. That's awesome. But that's only one side of the coin. That's really only one side of the story, because along with it, they hurt the people. They gathered resources like gold and diamonds and oil and whatnot, and took that back to Britain while not allowing the people in those regions to profit from those natural resources. So really, when you do that, it has a huge cultural effect on the people. So one of the big negatives, of course, is this also cost numerous cultures their independence, destroyed local economies, and even led to war and death. And as mentioned, this is an offshoot of what we talk about in world history in 11th grade. We'll look more specifically at the details there, but when you go in and take people's stuff and leave them with nothing, it's going to lead to some pretty dramatic consequences that follow. So one of the big consequences that comes out of this British imperialism, this quest for more land and a bigger empire, is a conflict in North America called the French and Indian War. It's also known as the 7 Years' War, and we are building up to watching a film in this class called The Last of the Mohicans, which is going to show us how these two countries, really the French and the British, fight. It's called the French and Indian War because the British are fighting the French and Native Americans who allied themselves with the French. So let's talk a little bit about that, make that a little bit less confusing. So many countries, including England, France, the Netherlands, and Spain, had an economic interest in colonizing North America. That means there was money to be made by having colonies once Columbus had discovered the New World. There's gold here, there's fur trapping, there's tobacco, lots of different things that you could make money off of back home in Europe. So that's going to lead to competition. Now, Great Britain competed with both France and Spain over trade and colonies in North America. And this clash led to the 7 Years' War, which actually lasted more than 7 years, from 1754 to 1763. It's also known as the French and Indian War because the French and natives were the main enemies of the British. The French found themselves allying themselves with the French because the French actually treated them a little bit better. Now, there were other countries involved. Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Austria were involved as well, and they often get overlooked in this story. Most people really tell this story as the British versus the French, but it's not that simple. In a lot of ways, this could have been a much bigger global conflict, maybe even been World War I, long before World War I even occurred. But in the end, it's a little bit more localized to the French and the British. Many Native American tribes were thrust in the middle. More tribes, such as the Iroquois League, allied themselves with the more culturally aware French. And I had just mentioned that the French, in a way, treated the natives better. They weren't great to the natives, but in certain ways, they were more friendly than the British were. Native Americans served as scouts to both sides due to the familiarity with the land. So you're not going to see a ton of fighting done by the Native Americans, although they did. They were supplied with rifles and things like that. But in a lot of ways, they were guides. They were helpers. They were there to help provide information about the land that the French and the British could use. Now, I don't want to talk about all the battles. I don't think that's important. I don't want us to go into all the details of how this was fought. And we're going to see some of that when we get into The Last of the Mohicans film. So we're going to kind of skip to the end. And in a lot of ways, that's the more important piece. So the war ended with the Treaty of Paris between France, Spain, and Great Britain. Overall, some 900,000 to 1.4 million died during the war, and it's a kind of a wide-ranging number, but history has a real tough time in determining casualties when you've got multiple parties involved. I mean, the Native Americans are going to tell you one number, the British are going to tell you one number, the French are going to tell you one number. It's not as easy as just adding all of those up and coming up with the total, because you might have some differing opinions on how many died on the other side, and that might contradict what one side is saying. So, we're looking at roughly 900,000 to 1.4 million died in the war, and that's a pretty significant number. Now, the war was a great success for Great Britain, because with the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain came out with some pretty good provisions in that treaty. So they gained the bulk of New France in North America. They gained Spanish Florida, some individual Caribbean islands, and Senegal on the West African coast. And of course, several pieces of this will be incorporated into America once we actually break away from the British. The big loser in all of this, of course, is the Native American tribes. The Native American tribes, especially those in the Ohio Valley, were excluded from the peace settlement and were unable to regain any control of any lands that they had in the Ohio Valley. Really, certainly solidifies the idea that the British are going to have control of much of the territory that was once controlled. Controlled and owned is a bad way to say it because Native Americans didn't view the land that way, but it certainly is going to push the Native Americans off land that they had been living on for a very long time. So the next film we're going to watch in this course is The Last of the Mohicans, which is a film about the British and the French fighting in North America, and we'll see some of the natives kind of being caught right in the middle of it here. The film stars Daniel Day-Lewis, and we'll introduce that here very shortly. So that's going to do it for us here today. With all of the contributions to government, literature, education, and industry that we talked about, we finished by looking at the idea that imperialism can lead to some negative things. And the big example here was it led to war in North America called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which we're about to see in the film The Last of the Mohicans. So it brings us to our learning targets as summarize the aspects of Western civilization that were provided by the British. You've got multiple examples there that you can use to help answer that learning target. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.